Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, with which we Muslims usually begin everything. I'm very glad that it has been possible for me to accept this invitation to give a series of lectures on metaphysics, starting with today's lecture, which is a kind of introduction to the whole program, organized by the Tokat Institute for Advanced Islamic Studies, which is doing very important service in the cause of Islamic studies and related subjects. And I also want to thank Dr. Farouk and Dr. Rustam, both young, very gifted scholars in the field who have done a great deal to make many activities, including this series, possible. I shall be speaking during the future weeks on different facets of metaphysics. And today I've been asked to give a kind of introductory lecture, which I've named Being and Consciousness. I shall be discussing later with you, dear listeners, metaphysics itself, but I want to start by clearing the field right now, because in Western thought, metaphysics as understood traditionally has either been marginalized, forgotten, or openly opposed, really since the time of Cartesian philosophies in the 17th century, more and more. There have been exceptions, Franz von Baader, a few people in Germany, but by and large, it has been neglected and opposed very, very strongly, as it is today, by logical positivism, which dominates over the American philosophical scene. And so it's very important to understand that there is such a thing as metaphysics. And metaphysics is a very important, in fact, central subject, intellectual subject. And I shall be dealing with it in 7 lectures starting next week after this opening talk, but it's very much in the center of my concerns today when I talk about being and consciousness. I speak as a humble student of universal metaphysics, not only as an Islamic theologian or philosopher, although both Islamic philosophy and theology are closely related to metaphysics as a whole, of course, in one way or another. We won't get into details of that. There is, for this reason, also, from the very beginning of the history of Islam, a great debate about what to name the subject. Ma ba'da tabi'a, ma fawqa tabi'a, ma'arafa, and so forth, hikmah, al-ilm al-ula, all of these. I will not translate these for you now because I'm going to get to them later, but I want to bring out the issue that when Islamic civilization came, was even debated how to name this field, but it has always been central to Islamic philosophy and Islamic intellectuality, and of course to Sufism. And when I speak, although I shall be making references also to other traditions about which I've made a few studies, but primarily as one who's rooted and grounded and educated in the Islamic tradition. I want to put my cards on the table, as they say. First of all, let's start with this question. What is the subject? What is the subject with which philosophy at the highest level, dealing with being and consciousness, deals? It can deal either with supreme reality as pure object, pure transcendence, that which is beyond everything that can be said of it, or pure immanence, the pure subject, of which all levels of reality are external manifestations. And when we talk about being and consciousness on a global intellectual level, it's very important to keep this in mind. When we study Hinduism, when we study Islam, when we study medieval Christian philosophy and theology, we study Jewish philosophy and theology, and many other traditions, we will see that these are the two grand ways of dealing with this question. One as the principle with the capital P, the divine, the origin, the source, as completely other, completely beyond, completely transcendent, or completely here, completely inward, completely inside, completely immanent. Let's not forget that this bifurcation and the two ways of looking at this reality as we go through this lecture. Now, I want to say a word about technical terms in discussing being and consciousness. Of course, these words in English come from Latin and Anglo-Saxon sources. Consciousness comes from Latin. Being comes from Anglo-Saxon languages, and they exist in English and enriched by centuries of their usage. In Islam, we have a very technical set of vocabulary as we have in Sanskrit and Hinduism. In Islam, it's very important that I mention the two, because the very root shows their interrelatedness. Being in Arabic and Persian and other Islamic languages, the word for it is usually wujūd. W-U-J-U-D, wujūd, which comes from the root to find, wajada, that comes from knowledge. Wujūd, the very word wujūd, epistemology, is related to the act of knowing, which is already related to consciousness. Its Persian equivalent is hasti, which is related to the English word is and the German ist. Hast. Hast is very similar to German ist, which is the equivalent of is in English or a in French, except the st is not pronounced in French. It's est, but it's the same word, So we have both Indo-European and Semitic words used in Islamic thought for wujūd. And as far as consciousness is concerned, it's very interesting. One of two words are used usually in Islamic philosophical and mystical Sufi discourse. One is the word shahūd. Shahūd, which means to be bear witness, to be present to something. Like when we become a Muslim, we say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu, that I bear witness, has its roots the same as the word shahūd. Shahūd means vision, seeing reality. And sometimes for consciousness, the word fikr and dhihn and those things, that is mental activity, are also used. But the most important term is shahūd, and the word which is related to it, the word wajdan. Wajdan, which is also derived from to find, wajada. So, in a sense, in Arabic, the inner unity between being and consciousness is already present in the language, the metaphysical significance of the language. I thought I would refer this issue to you in order to think about how important, in fact, traditional languages are in conveying deep metaphysical truth through the very structure, if you were only to understand what they are trying to convey. Now, in Greek thought, for the first time, we have a philosophical discourse on being. The Greek word for be is on, and science of being is called ontology. To this day in English, ontology in French, and all European languages use the Greek word. Ontology, which is a very, very key and important term, means the science of being. This word was used. And then when Latin became prevalent, of course, Latin words like existence and so forth also came into being. And I shall get to that in just a moment, the distinction that is made. But I want to turn to this point. In Islamic thought, interest in the study of wujūd, of ontology, begins very early in Islamic philosophy and Sufism. And especially in Islamic philosophy, already Abu Yaqub al-Kindi, the so-called Arab philosopher, the first famous Arab Islamic philosopher, who was an Arab, most of others are Persian, but he was an Arab. He discussed the question of being. Now, why were Muslims interested so much in the question of being? More than Aristotle and Plato in a certain sense. It's because of monotheism, of the religious world, the meaning of revelation, which is based on the divine reality, and therefore concerned with being with the capital B. In Arabic, we don't have capitalization, but what would correspond to being with the capital B in English, with être with the capital E in French. That's that kind of thing. And the developed from that very, very extensive discussion of being. Being, beings, existence, existent, and so forth and so on. And they developed something which in a primary simple lecture I already cannot get too deeply into, but I have to mention it to allow you to understand universality of the concept of being, and of course the reality of being, which I shall discuss in a moment. In Islamic philosophy, we distinguish between several understandings of wujūd. Let me just use the Arabic term for a moment. The first is wujūd bishart al-shay'. That is wujūd under condition of something. Like this table exists, you exist, I exist, my voice exists, that goes into your ear, and so on and so on. Bishart al-shay'. Then we have wujūd bishart Allah, la shay'. That is wujūd without being identified with a particular shay'. And then we have wujūd la bishart. The la comes after shart before, not before. La bishart. Bishart la bishart. That is completely unconditional wujūd. Completely unconditional wujūd. And the highest and most difficult thing to understand, when we're studying Islamic philosophy, is one of the most difficult issues to understand when we're studying traditional teachers in Iran. And that is what's called wujūd la bishart maqsami. That is wujūd without condition that pertains to everything you can say of wujūd. In a sense, partaking of absolute wujūd, relative wujūd. Absolute wujūd belongs to God, relative wujūd is the cosmos, the world, to us, and all levels of wujūd. And this remarkable division, which we do not have in Western philosophy in the same way, is one of the major contributions of Islamic thought to ontology. to the question of being. And then you have finally, as things develop fully, both in Islamic thought and as a result of influence of Islamic thought in the West by medieval Western philosophy, especially St. Thomas Aquinas, you can say that you can distinguish 4 different levels of being. First of all, being with a capital B, S, with a capital E, that is the divine being. Then being with a small b, which is the being of the tree, the being of the boat, the being of the road, the being of my coat, etc. Then you have existence with a capital E. Existence with a capital E in traditional cosmology is in the descent of reality from God, from absolute being, the first principle, which itself is a generating principle of all the lower levels of cosmic existence. That's existence with a capital E. And then you have existence with a small e, which is the ordinary existence of things. Here, my pen on this exists. My glasses exist. You're sitting there exist. Usually, many of us exist. So we have 4 different meanings when we start being. Talk about being with the capital B, which pertains only to the divine in the monotheistic religions and also in Hinduism and other religions which begin with the one. Ultimately, all religions begin with the one. Some remain silent, but those have developed theologies, even if they start with the void shunyata, like you have in Buddhism and Hinduism, that corresponds to the absolute reality. And then being with a small b, being of things, E with a capital E, which is the principle of the existential order below being, below the divine being, and then existence, the ordinary sense that we use all the time. It's important to keep all these 4 in mind. And I must add also here that there is another point to add metaphysically. So my lecture is on being and consciousness. But full metaphysics does not begin with being. It begins with non-being. That is a reality that transcends even the concept of being, which is the most universal concept that our mind can hold. Non-being with a capital N. Non-être in French. And we have this developed in, for example, in Islamic Metaphysics, the school of Ismailism, very, very clearly that the divine reality itself is about being. And being is the first act of the divine reality. So I need to add that for a little lecture like that. I cannot go into this, but you should at least hear about it. You hear about it, in a sense, being with a capital B is the first determination of absolute reality, which is non-being. Not without being, but in a sense above its first determination, which is being. This needs to be known. It's a very subtle point, and there's a lot of discussion. For those of you who are interested about this, different people have written about it. A wonderful passages on this by Friedrich Schwann. My own knowledge in the sacred has a whole section devoted to this. There's the chapter on ontology. Anyway, I want to draw your attention to it. Now we come to consciousness. The modern world, because of the predominance of the idea of evolution since 19th century Darwinism, spread in the West and now through the West and other parts of the world, considers consciousness to have evolved. That is, from the molecules of the soup of molecules banging against each other. We have Johann Sebastian Bach and Einstein. They were somehow in that bowl of soup that evolved over time to very high levels of consciousness. At the great saints, for example, Francis of Assisi was in a bowl of soup. If I can use such a term, astaghfirullah, as we say, God forbid. But anyway, that's the absurdity of this view. From a traditional point of view, our reality, the world, begins with consciousness. God is consciousness, and He created the world in consciousness. And the first thing He created was consciousness. We have a hadith saying of the Prophet of Islam, أول ما خلق الله العقل. The first thing that God created was the intellect. Now, the intellect implies consciousness, knowledge. That was the first thing that God created. So consciousness was there from the beginning. Just might add, for those of you who are interested, when I gave the famous Dudley lecture at Harvard a few years ago, the title of my talk was "In the Beginning Was Consciousness." I discussed that extensively. It's a very important subject I cannot get into in detail, but I have to mention it. So consciousness has always been around, you might say. There's been no terrestrial reality without consciousness. And consciousness is not only human consciousness. It is also consciousness of the animals. Even plants have a form of consciousness. They turn with the sun. There's a form of knowledge that the plant has. And that's why the Hindus have developed the idea that everything is levels of consciousness. From the dust to the stars, from the cow to sacred saints of India. Everything actually begins from consciousness. Consciousness was there from the very beginning. Consciousness did not evolve from matter. This is absolutely essential to understand. Whether you accept it or not is something else, but to understand, in order to understand what humanity has believed for the last 10,000 years, as far as we know. As far as we know. And if you don't want to accept it, that's something else. But at least to know the reality, the historical reality. There's no religion that has taught that consciousness gradually evolved from mud. No religion ever taught. Even Hinduism, which speaks of the Vishnu first creating various creatures before creating man, or God created Adam from clay but breathed His spirit into him. It's not the clay that evolved into the spirit of Adam. It was the breath of God, according to Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, that made Adam. That is the Adamic state, the human state. So this is a very, very important point to understand if you're going to understand traditional metaphysics. That is, consciousness has always been there. Furthermore, there are certain Indians, especially modern interpreters of Hinduism, who say there's only one consciousness. But traditionally, there are levels of consciousness. In the same way that you have levels of being, from God's being to that of the angels, to that of the intermediate world, to that of the material world, and so forth and so on. The maratib al-wujūd in Islam, the hierarchy of being, the chain of being of Christian thought, and so forth and so on. All of that is there in the same way you have that in consciousness. From the traditional point of view, you might say in the same way that some people are physically stronger than others, some people are more than others. It is the act of being stronger than them and consciousness, of more awareness, more consciousness. It's not only quantitative, Ibn Arabi did not know anything about Zen Buddhism, but he knew a lot more about what Zen Buddhism really is than most Japanese walking the streets of Tokyo, obviously. So that's not, it's a question of quantity. It's a question of quality. It's a question of quality. And consciousness has levels. All religions are there to make us climb the levels of consciousness. When you say to make us better human beings, ethics, virtue, all of these religions teach in order to allow us to be more conscious, be more aware, become aware of where we come from and where we're going. Most of us, especially in the modern world, are sleepwalking through life. We're asleep. Even 1400 years ago, the Prophet of Islam said, man is sleeping, and when he dies, he awakens. And that's what the Sufis took from that and say, die before you die, that because the Prophet also said that. So you shall not die when you die. As a saying of the Prophet, mutu qabla an tamutu. And that is therefore, wake up. That is, be conscious. Wake up. The call of religion is wake up. Wake up. That the consciousness is within you. At the heart of our being is divine consciousness itself. A lot of Salafi Muslims, modern, oh, why are you saying that? But Prophet said, Qalbul Mu'min Ashur Rahman. The heart of the believer is the throne of God as the merciful. He didn't say that. The founder of Islam said it. And in every religion you have that. You have that. So many sayings in Christianity, so many sayings in Judaism and other religions, and of course Hinduism, a lot of references. So the question is to be aware and to wake up. We have access to levels of consciousness. Now, consciousness involves not only the world of forms, but also beyond forms. Beyond the world of form, beyond the formal world. The world of forms is not only physical forms, but even that of the intermediate world. But beyond that is the formless. And God has given us the power of being conscious of the formless. To know, you might say, the form of the formless. Of course, the first form would be metaphorical. To know the formless. But usually we know things through form. The physical form, mathematical form, geometrical form, this, that. That's kind of form in the vastest sense of the meaning of the term. But consciousness has reached a level where it can know the formless, go beyond form. And all of religion has to do with our consciousness. And that's why also in European languages of Latin, conscience and consciousness are interrelated etymologically. To have consciousness, you have to have a conscience. And consciousness without conscience is a great infirmity. It's not to be, if you are fully conscious, we'll have conscience. If we're fully conscious is to realize who we are, where we come from, where we are going, and therefore to be aware of how we act, to have a conscience. Without consciousness, there would be no conscience. But there are people who have no conscience, but have consciousness. It's not that they have no conscience, they've forgotten it. And the inner teaching of all religions is there, most of all, to draw those people who have forgotten to remember. To remember, to remember. That's the heart of all religion. The heart of religion. To remember where we come from, what we're doing here, where we're going. Once we understand that, the path of life becomes enlightened, becomes clearer. And we're not lost in the maze of doubt, of taking the wrong turn, of all the ups and downs of life, which most of us face because we took the wrong street at the wrong time. This happens in so many human lives, and especially today. Now, I'm supposed to speak only 2-3 more minutes. I'm a very meticulous person. In the time, it's from bad habit from MIT. Usually Persians don't pay attention to clocks and they keep going on. I'm not like that. I keep my time, but I want to just say a few words at the end about the fact that only authentic metaphysics is a science which can understand being in its roots and manifestations and levels of consciousness and their interrelation. Our mode of being determines our consciousness, and the transformation of a consciousness can affect our mode of being, both ways. But there's science which can explain that is what traditionally was called metaphysics, hikmah, with which I'll be dealing in the next 7 lectures very extensively. I will not take your time now. But I just want to conclude by saying that only metaphysics among the sciences is able to understand being in depth, consciousness in depth, and the relation together. Neither psychology on one side, medicine on the other side, modern theology on one side, modern philosophy on the other side can achieve this end. And also, it's this metaphysical knowledge that alone can act as a serious foundation for true knowledge, for etymology. There is no authentic etymology without an authentic ontology and metaphysics. Modern Western philosophy is very much interested in epistemology, not at all interested in ontology and metaphysics. But whether it be Islamic, Platonic, Neoplatonic, Hindu, Buddhist philosophies, and so forth and so on, going down the list, the Kabbalah and Jewish philosophy, they always emphasize the nexus between being and consciousness, that the two are interrelated, and therefore to know epistemology has to have a metaphysical foundation. Before I know, I must know. How do I know that I know? How can I be certain that I'm speaking to you right now? It's an immediate intuition. Yes, Mr. because you see. But the fact that I trust my eyes, that and my ear that I'm talking to you, that is more than just external vision. It's a way of looking at the world based on a certitude, which ultimately goes back, whether I've thought about it or not, to metaphysical truth. The relation between creatures, between beings, between human beings. The fact that I'm sitting here and can talk to you, and you can understand what I'm saying. And here I am, a Persian, mother tongue is Persian, speaking English in Washington, D.C., to people from all over the world. What is it that unites us? It's being and consciousness. We share ultimately something in the cosmic consciousness, of the cosmic consciousness, although we all have our own consciousness, we have our own soul, but we also share something of what traditional philosophy called the world soul. and the cosmic consciousness. And so the whole question, subject of being and consciousness, something that is very central to any serious study of truth, of metaphysics, in the real sense of the word. And in the next 7 lectures, they say in Islam, inshallah, God willing, I shall be dealing with different aspects of metaphysics for you. Thank you.
Professor Nasr, thank you very much for that wonderful exposition.
Is that you, Dr. Rostam?
It is.
Assalamu alaikum. I can't see your face, but I recognize your voice.
Barakallah feek. Yeah, we're here. You know, there's always people. You see,
there you are. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, I'm well. How are you?
In Canada or somewhere else?
I am in Canada right now. It's in the Barzakh, actually, moving between.
Joined the United States yet? Is it an independent country?
Yes, inshallah.
Combat isn't taken over yet, huh?
That's why it's a Barzakh, precisely. Inshallah, we hope to join you very soon for your metaphysics class in a couple of days.
Inshallah.
There were over 200 participants, Professor Nasr, in this class, and many questions have come in, mashallah. So I'm going to try to, in some cases, summarize the questions for you, and in some cases, ask them directly, just in the best interest of time. The first question came from one student, which was I couldn't help but address it. She asked, "What should I be asking you?" So it wasn't a question as much as it was.
I will answer it. Where should I go? That's the most important question.
Jameel. All right. Wonderful. All right. The next question. Somebody asked a question about astrology and its relationship to awakening. How is astrology related to awakening and consciousness?
You're talking about 2 different things. Learning about astrology or practicing it are 2 very different things. Learning about it, it's a traditional science. Like, in fact, in Greek, astronomia and astrologia are have the same meaning. They don't have separate meaning. And also in nujum, in Arabic, the word nujum can mean both. So they were not really separated from each other. But the question of using astrology to predict the future, this is against Islamic law. And although a lot of Muslims practice it, I'm not saying they don't practice it, but from the legal point of view, because the future belongs to God, the hands of God. And I'm completely opposed to using astrology in that sense. But astrology reveals a human character on its archetypal level, if one is a good astrologer. It's a very important science from that point of view. On that level, I'm all in accord. My book on Islamic cosmology has a whole chapter on astrology, which I've tried to explain that. But to use astrology to predict the future, or as we have in your country and my country, your aunt and my aunt in Pakistan and Iran, if they want to have rice instead of beans, they ask astrologer what they should do, that kind of thing. I do not agree with it. It's also a kind of superstition in a real sense. It's a kind of popularization, which also destroys the element of astrology, which is both cosmologically and also psychologically of great interest.
Yes. Barakallah feek. Right. Somebody asked this question here about what is the relationship, or how do we understand consciousness as it pertains to our awareness and our dreaming and sleeping state?
Awareness actually is another word for consciousness, except it has an added element of being fully conscious, to be aware. But in order to be aware, you have to be conscious. So it includes consciousness. Now, in the dream state, our consciousness still functions, but it's in an intermediate world in which our will has no relation to what, in fact, we experience, and therefore what our consciousness experiences and comes to know. And secondly, you can be conscious of a picture on a screen of a tiger, which is not a real tiger, but it's only a picture on the screen. And sometimes it's so real that the consciousness cannot distinguish between the real tiger and the picture of it or a statue of it somewhere. That's true. That's true. Consciousness is not always ineffable and without making mistakes. In the dream state, we have a form of consciousness, and it goes on its own, and we have no control over it. The human will does not play a role. Whereas during our awakened state, our human will also plays a role in what we're conscious of. If you enter a room and there are 3 people there, 2 of whom are your friends, 1 you don't like at all, your will to be conscious of what those 2 friends are saying and will not to be conscious of what the third person you're not interested in saying. So the will is related to consciousness. This relationship does not exist in the dream state. Our dream has no power, actually, over that feeble level of consciousness that manifests itself in our dreams. And then you have something else at the other level. Occasionally you have vertical dreams, which the soul travels to high levels of being. And one becomes conscious of realities. Let's say one's mother is going to die and one has a dream and she dies the next week, this kind of thing, of elements and truths which have not manifested themselves in the spatial temporal order. That also is a possibility.
Thank you. Now, the next question, Professor Nasr, it concerns the relationship or the responsibility towards the natural environment. If we participate in consciousness, and if that participation is nothing other than a divine and sacred kind of enactment, what then are our ethical and moral responsibilities towards nature?
That's very important. If you are really fully conscious, you will realize that all creatures are conscious. The Quran says, كُلُّ شَيْءٍ يُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِهِ. All beings hymn the praise of God. That frog also has its own consciousness. That tree also has its own consciousness. In fact, the person of the high level of consciousness is very much aware of that. Consciousness is not limited to human consciousness. Of course, if we have a parrot, we know it's also conscious because you talk to the parrot that repeats your name back and so forth. But we don't think of the tree out in the garden as being conscious, but it is conscious, has its own level of consciousness. That's on the basis of that Hinduism considers all levels of reality not to be levels of being, but levels of consciousness. That's a possible way of looking at the nature of things.
Wonderful. Now, the next question, it concerns what is the brain in relation to consciousness? Is consciousness somehow contained in the brain, or are they distinct?
This is a very important question. Modern science considers the consciousness or the mind to be simply a function of the chemicals in the brain. How this happens, of course, they don't explain. But traditionally, this is not acceptable. And the great British scientist, Sir John Eccles, was one of the greatest authorities on the brain and a very famous doctor. He wrote a book called The Brain and Its Mind, The Mind and Its Brain, showing that the mind is not simply the activity of the brain, but the brain is an instrument which the mind uses. It was a very different thing, and therefore mind has a reality independent of the brain. I have said that point of view completely. I knew Sir John Eccles personally, and once we had lunch there in London, we spoke 2 hours about this issue. He was presenting the most precise scientific reasons for showing that, in fact, the mind is not the brain. The brain is an instrument of the mind. And so consciousness is not a product of the brain, but it makes use of the brain and also the rest of our body. And we're not conscious of the tip of my finger and go like this. But the tip of my finger doesn't create my consciousness. My consciousness that moves the tip of my finger. That the control that consciousness allows us to have over our body is because it's really an independent reality. It's not simply the product of the body. If it was just simply the product of the body, you could not have control over the whole body anyway. So this is a very important issue, because modern materialism, which now has taken over so much, especially in modern medicine, which is based on it, it's very difficult for it to accept a reality in its worldview other than the physical or biological reality of the patient with which the doctor deals.
Thank you. This one is also a fusion of a couple of questions, which asks about the relationship between intelligence and consciousness. What is the link between them, especially in modern culture, where many people are, we throw the word intelligent and intellectual around without necessarily reference to somebody who's penetrated the higher levels of consciousness. So if you can shed light.
It's a very important philosophical question. Consciousness has need of intelligence on a certain level, but it's not identical to intelligence. But a very intelligent person can be conscious of the trees blowing in the wind, and a very unintelligent person can also be conscious of the same reality. Their intelligence does not determine their consciousness of events, let's say, which they see. Or even the question of goodness. A person can be very intelligent and not be conscious of the importance of goodness. And a person can be not so intelligent, but be a very good person and be conscious of the importance of goodness for one's soul. So the two are not identical, but consciousness implies the presence of some level of intelligence. And intelligence also is related to consciousness if you take consciousness cosmic aspect. Otherwise, for example, scorpion. Scorpion can bite with the end of its tail. It's very interesting. If you draw a circle on the ground, a fire, and lit it, pour oil and lit it, and put a scorpion in the middle. It will go all around to try to get out. When it cannot get out, it goes in the middle and stings itself and dies, commits suicide. Now, that scorpion obviously has a certain level of consciousness and a certain level of intelligence, because it knows it's trapped and doesn't want to be imprisoned and kills itself. Suicide needs awareness, and intelligent people don't commit suicide, but it needs a certain intelligence to analyze the issues, which then leads the soul to want to do that. So this is a very interesting, very, very interesting issue, whoever brought it up, and it needs really much more discussion than I'm able to give it in a few minutes, but this is the gist of it.
Yes, Professor Nasr, can we ask one last question? Babakshi, from the time that you answered the first question till just now, I think about maybe 30 more questions have come in. So please forgive me, audience, if I've not been able to forward your questions directly to Professor Nasr. But I'm sure you can understand the conundrum we're in. But there is one that really gets to the heart of the matter, no pun intended, and that has to do with what is the seat of consciousness in Islamic metaphysics. Where is it?
Heart, the heart. The seat of life, people accept as the heart. But people think that the seat of the mind is in the brain. Because certain functions of the brain, of the mind, have to do with the brain, obviously. But in all traditions, not only Islam, consciousness on the highest level, there's knowledge, and knowledge always implies consciousness. On the highest level, was identified with the heart. What we call heart knowledge. Heart knowledge is a Christian term, it's not an Islamic term. But in Islam, of course, is very, very important. You have Aynul Qalb, Chashma Dil, the eye of the heart, which you also have in Christianity, which was known very well to Christian mysticism, which was identified in iconography with the third eye, which is here, the sense with which one sees the inner reality of things. So there is a relationship between the heart and knowledge. The heart is not only the seat of the biological part of a being, but also seat of our emotions and of our intellect, of our ruh, of our spirit. It's very interesting that my heartache, you fall in love, my heart so-and-so. You are afraid, my heart so-and-so. What the heck does this heart have to do with all the psychological states? Has everything to do with it. Because it's not only the question of blood pressure going up and down, therefore of fate in the heart. It's a much deeper thing. The heart is the heart of the human microcosm. And we use the word heart, I use it on purpose as meaning the center. The heart is the center. Anyway, it's been a pleasure to have spent this hour with you. And I hope, inshallah, at least some of you I shall see on Monday when I start my discussion of the metaphysical issues.